The saturation in a musical environment that I had, like most of English schoolboys of my age in that generation, I was, of course, in a cathedral choir. So you get sort of this amazing music education by virtue of exposure, 5, 6 different pieces a day, everything from plain chant right through the canon of choral music to things that were written last week. That's a pretty intensive, musical experience, for sure. Towards the end of that part of my career, which of course inevitably was sort of in the 12, 13 range, they sort of port you across onto some level of instrumental training. So I had piano and cello in my life, but I was always interested in creating my own music. And I think largely that came from, I loved music that was just beyond my technical ability to actually play. And so the next best thing was actually to craft my own music that I could sort of feel musically fulfilled in, versus trying to learn this impossible piece like the three dances from Petrushka or something like that. It's where I began. I mean, from about the age of 8. I love choral music. I've certainly written a lot of it. I was able to kind of keep active as a choral singer up until my first couple of years at Emory. I was just exposed to so many kinds of different musical languages and music, not just sort of as a boy in kind of a choral context, but also just instrumentally, and listening was, just a very super active part. I distinctly remember probably at about 10 purchasing a mini score of Holst's Planets, and I would listen to that over and over and over and over again and do some semblance of conducting to sort of be physically engaged with the music. And it's kind of coming from that background, and particularly as a teacher of composition, I've really adopted the approach that there is pretty much always merit to the music, even if you don't aesthetically like it. If you have to appreciate the integrity of the creative endeavor. I think I'm composing for myself. In sort of younger days, as it were, I was always composing for wherever the piece was about to be housed. It's going to that choir, it's going to that quartet, or that wind ensemble. And I think that actually allows for a certain sort of superficiality to sort of creep in. It's sort of like you are assigning the music or delivering it to somebody else kind of outside of yourself. And even though the latest couple of pieces, including the Atlanta Symphony Commission, that was obviously going to the Atlanta Symphony, but somehow, I guess it's just part of the maturation process in creativity. It's much more about, I feel, what's inside me is finally coming out. And part of that's just, I think, just an increasing confidence in the writing. It's just like, this is what I mean, and I know that this will work, and this is kind of a stretch, and I'm not exactly sure how this will work, but you know what? I haven't done it before, so I'm going to do it. And so there's sort of a security in the writing which also permits the more personal kind of inner workings of the music to come out. The music is sort of like a child, and so you sort of create it from a selfish standpoint. But when it's out in the world, then the rest of the procedure has to be selfless. I mean, you pour hours and hours into this to really sort of craft it. And if you're writing for people that you know, like the Vega Quartet here, or Atlanta Symphony, where you know a lot of them, it takes on sort of a different guise almost, because it's like you're writing for individuals and musicians that you really respect and know, and who are also going to want to know why this part isn't more interesting that you wrote for them if it's not. As with the answers to sort of most complex questions like that, I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think it operates on many simultaneous levels. I mean, there are, kind of the inherent cultural references. So, this type of music, or this kind of particular style of music, we would equate with, a particular happening in the canon of movies that we're exposed to. And so there's sort of like a popular cultural association with that kind of musical gesture or language or energy that we all mostly, I would imagine, in Western culture are exposed to. There are absolutely the personal connections, where in the same way that I would imagine we associate smell and taste with a particular event, if a particular piece of music has been around at the time of us experiencing a particular personal event, or even if that music has been sort of woven into the tapestry of our experience of that event, like, I don't know, the Barber Adagio for strings being played at a relative's funeral or something like that, it takes on a very kind of personal meaning beyond the cultural reference that is there. Everything from that basic kind of conception in Western music that major is happy and minor is sad. And then, of course, then also creatively, depending on what you're doing with it, major can also be sad, and minor could arguably be happy, depending on the relationship with your tempo and timbre and the rhythmic organization of the music. There are, again, many different strategies and ways of beginning that you sort of bring to bear until the one that's going to work for that particular piece or moment in your life, or kind of where you are in your psyche, kind of works. I mean, quite a lot of the time, and this was interesting, this was a resonance that I had with Adam Schoenberg that we discovered. I mean, he said, sometimes when I begin, I just improvise at the piano. And it's like, yes, I actually do that a fair amount too. I mean, sometimes it's just sort of an aesthetic warm-up. Nothing that I improvise actually ever kind of gets into the piece, but it releases you from having to worry about rhythm and chords and structure. There's a direct connection from the spontaneous musician in you and the instrument of choice, which largely for me tends to be the piano. So, improvisation can often access, some of those, kind of beginning ideas. Or if I've got a rough idea kind of sketched out that I've sort of, kind of created in my head, I'll improvise kind of around that to kind of see what other material may kind of appear. So if I have to kind of extend a melody or a progression, or I just kind of want to get a hands-on sense of some big kind of orchestral climactic moment where I'm hitting like 8,000 wrong notes, but the gesture that I'm sort of coming up with on the piano tells me that, oh, it's one of those. And then, of course, I have to go back to the manuscript pad and actually organize that and give it more detail. There's always that great moment where it's like, well, yeah, the piece is essentially finished, and then it's like, what is the second flute actually going to play? And so you then have to get under the surface in much, much more details. So improvisation is part of it. I generally also, like Adam, I think, and many other composers, it's like I need a starting point or a vision. It's what we refer to in the composition studio here as what is the source of your inspiration. And it doesn't have to be a single source, but is it a personal experience? Is it the reflecting of somebody else's creative endeavor, like a painting, but you kind of want to do that in music? Is it a fragment of poetry or what have you, or prose that you are going to embody the text? Or are you using the text to sort of drive the musical imagery? I'm still very much an 11 by 17 landscape orientation, manuscript pad, sketching ideas and melodic fragments and that kind of thing, as part of how I do things. And I generally end up with sort of a flow chart or a map, a kind of a sonic map of how the piece is going to kind of unfold, and well, this part is going to go there and this part's going to go there, and then of course we get into much more detail of what actually happens in those parts and how do we flow from one thing to the other. But part of that process has definitely been, well, but what about if I moved section 4 to become section 6, and section 5 becomes section 3. So in the flow of the music, it kind of makes the other sections say something different just because of their new juxtaposition, if you like, so that you can start to get a sense of how the dialogue or the message of the piece is going to progress. And that can kind of tell you things about proportion. It can tell you things about the dramaturgy of the piece, that we're going to have a high point here and then this oasis, and then things are going to get really kind of angry here, and that is going to result in X happening. And I think I'm getting better at this. A couple of years ago when I wrote the Third Symphony, an extraordinary amount of time was actually spent kind of shifting sections of the music around, kind of just to see what effect that really had, that if this event happened in ahead of this event, then what did that do in terms of changing our perception of how the piece progressed? But then if we moved it back, what happened? And that took a ton of time. And then for this latest piece, there was a great aha moment where it was like, oh, wait, if I move that there, then, oh, that happens, and magically it actually fits as well. There wasn't even anything that I needed to sort of change, as a transition points in between it, and it really, kind of altered the flow of the piece in a very positive way. The concern that I have with that, and also just the integration of technology into the creative process, is that quite often even a notation program like Finale or Sibelius, industry standards, will actually start making decisions for you by way of being helpful. And if you're not aware that they are making decisions for you, you can just let it happen. Now, of course, it depends on what type of music you're writing. I mean, if you're writing sort of process music, or music in which the technology is supposed to play that kind of part, then obviously that's fine. For me as an acoustical composer, it's like I want to make the decision of whether that is a G flat or an F sharp, because in the context of the melodic line or in the the sanctity of the mode that I'm using, it's really an F sharp, not a G flat. Even small decisions like that, or even larger decisions that you suddenly find that the software is being very smart and trying to make for you, might not actually be the decision that you want. And if you're learning the creative process, you might sort of be blissfully unaware that it's making those decisions for you. Interestingly, I did not. Largely, I was just sort of letting the music have its own organic flow, and would then spend a considerable amount of time reorganizing kind of the progression of things or the dramaturgy of the work, and then got what I thought was kind of a really striking flow. I'm thinking in particular of the first movement of the symphony, and then actually when I went back and looked, it was basically in sonata form. So yeah, I mean, it's just, I knew there was no sort of conscious effort at all to make it like that. It was just the best way that those musical components fit together and flowed, and what have you. And so music, of course, is that so many composers deliberately try and avoid any of the kind of standardized architectures of the past, because of course you don't want to be associated with all of that stuff in the past. You want to sort of break with tradition and make strikingly new kind of music, either harmonically or structurally or otherwise. And so it was just extremely funny to me that I thought I was working in this incredibly organic way, had that movement written, reorganized some things, got the best result I thought possible, and it was in sonata form. Well, there are actually a couple of sections in the piece, which I think of sort of loosely as a tone poem. I mean, it's too short to be an overture, and it certainly doesn't have the character of being an overture or a fanfare, obviously in a 15-minute time frame with that level of kind of musical or hoped for musical intensity. But there are actually a couple of sections in the music that are marked drammatico or molto drammatico, and then all kinds of other sort of descriptive terms in there that would lend themselves to almost like the notes on the script for a play, I think, in terms of the character that I was trying to give various sections or solo voices within the orchestra. So I think that's a very accurate representation. You would be correct. This painting was actually done by a wonderful student that I had in Oklahoma, who was a double major in violin performance and visual art. And this was part of her senior show many years ago. And I snapped that one up because, to me, it really is sort of the individual staring into the darkness, and it's sort of what are you going to make of that? Are you going to sort of leap forth into the darkness? Are you staring down the darkness? I mean, sort of what is going on? And I mean, I do have in a lot of my music kind of the darker sort of lyrical, pathos-ridden elements going on there. I'm getting better at writing happy pieces. Background music? No, I don't. That's an impossibility for me. I mean, the one car wreck that I've had, well, I've actually had two car wrecks in my life, but the one that was actually my fault was I happened, interestingly, as he was just here, and I should have blamed him for this. I was listening to Philip Glass's Songs from Liquid Days, which was the collaboration he did with Laurie Anderson and Kronos and Paul Simon. But listening to that, driving on my way to a rehearsal, and was trying to figure out the number of layers of kind of strata of rhythm in there, and managed to rear-end somebody at a red light because I was looking but I wasn't seeing. So I tend not to listen to music just as sort of like an abstract background thing while I'm working, because I'm far too involved in what I'm hearing. The one thing that I can listen to, I've discovered as I'm driving, is jazz. And I love jazz, and I've got several great friends, including the wonderful Gary Motley here, as jazz musicians. And so it's not like I think jazz is some superficial wallpaper music, but there's something about it where I can actually be engaged with it, but not massively distracted. Everything else, because it's the world that I move in, I think, is terribly distracting. If I'm writing an orchestral piece or if I'm working on a string quartet, I'll go through a period of saturation where I'll listen to a whole bunch of string quartets, which has nothing to do with, I'm trying to find ideas. It's to do with kind of embedding kind of the string quartet sound in my ear, so that when I'm sort of imagining, kind of material, or if I'm working material out either on the page or at the keyboard, I can kind of turn on the string quartet sound, because I've just sort of saturated and refreshed my memory of what all of those kind of timbres are. The great composer should be aware of the inheritance within the art of composing and music and all of the kind of the culture of writing music has led to the point where you are as just part of the process. So you have to be kind of aware and appreciative of that, one would imagine, on an aesthetic and a technical level and maybe an experiential level of having played it. But you should also be as aware of everything as you can be going on around you. Where do you fit in that continuum of musical creativity? Because it comes as a shock to some composers and certainly some musicians that they're in fact just part of something, they're not actually the thing. To me, this is not exactly original. The conductor is mostly sort of a product of the 19th century because that's where the ensembles had grown to an extent, and the complexity of the music had grown to an extent that it needed what became the heroic figure of the conductor wrestling these titanic forces and being the interpreter of the great music. So conductors of classical music, I think are more not so much desperately needed gestural people to kind of get or keep everything together, so much as they are advocates for the composer in terms of making sure that the style is accurate and kind of that things are happening in that period of music that are hopefully fulfilling the composer's intent, and that you're not playing a Mozart symphony in the style of a Mahler symphony, and that kind of thing. So they're more the keepers, I think, of the original intent of the period. Do you need a conductor for Bach? No, he didn't. But you're not going to just sort of be able to coach Mahler 2 with an orchestra or Shostakovich 10 and just leave them alone to their own devices. There are just too many moving parts, and I think now, of course, we've got a well-established tradition of the conductor needing, by rights, to be a highly educated, informed, intelligent, thinking musician who's going to put their own stamp on these things. Well, yeah, Robert's absolutely my favorite conductor right now. He could not be my favorite conductor right now, because to sort of get to share part of this sort of creative act, I could have written the piece and it could never have seen the light of day. So, having the live performance and just his graciousness in being able to interact on stage, where it was no, that really still doesn't sound right. Let's kind of figure out why. And to be able to interact with an orchestra and a conductor at that level and kind of work all those things out is fantastic. So still floating on air, riding on cloud nine. So yes, right now Robert is absolutely my favorite conductor. One can learn so much from the conductors who have come before you and who are around you now. I've been doing this for a very long time, and I learned a huge amount from just watching Robert conduct and rehearse. Had nothing to do with my music, but with my conductor hat on. And you never stop learning. I think this is part of the kind of the ego problem with some members of the profession, conducting and otherwise, or perhaps any profession, that you achieve success and you think in your own little bubble where you control the musical universe in which you're in, you are the supreme being, and then you close yourself off to experiences that could actually inform you and make you sort of continue to grow as that supreme being. So yeah, I certainly have lots of conductors. Schulte, I thought just had some wonderful wisdom and kind of things to share. I do think that Barenboim certainly had some things. I got as a student to actually interact with Simon Rattle a little, now Sir Simon Rattle. But so I got to do a couple of summer things with him when he was still at CBSO, and just to be around somebody of that ilk and that caliber who just lives and breathes music is actually an inspiration. I mean, you don't necessarily learn concrete things from them, but just to sort of be in their orbit just for a short amount of time is, kind of re-energizes you when you sort of come back to your own universe, I think.